Okay. Okay, let me talk about the Korean startup ecosystem. The Korean startup ecosystem in 2020 is stronger than ever despite the impact of COVID-19. The South Korean government has done a great job of flattening the curve of COVID-19 by harnessing technology. It may surprise some to know that the economy of South Korea is now the fourth largest in all of Asia. We have one of the best wireless infrastructure, yet Korea is still globally not recognized as a startup tech hub. This is because the rise from being one of the poorest countries in the world to the highest developed country in just 60 years is not commonly known. South Korea is only one of three countries, except Russia and China in the world, where Google is not the primary search engine. Therefore, the world does not have access to information related to South Korea since most of the content is on Naver, a search engine that is not used outside of Korea. However, despite this, South Korea continues to be one of the fastest growing developed countries in the world. As you see from the graphs here, the global entrepreneur activities in worldwide, you can see how the South Korea, the entrepreneur is the biggest portion. The Korean government also assists in programs to help the startup ecosystem. South Korea has the highest government backing per capita for startups. I gonna mention about the TIPS, the TIPS, but there is also the K Startup Challenge, which promotes collaboration between domestic and foreign startups. All companies from the K Startup Challenges work out of the Pangyo Global Startup Campus. As Veronica already visited the Pangyo district, the campus was opened in 2016 by the Korean government as part of the new startup hub. The K Startup Challenge, along with the Seoul Global Startup Center, is focused on bringing in foreign entrepreneurs to start businesses in South Korea. If they are successful, they will be able to hire Koreans, which will increase jobs in Korea. This is the map of the short map for the overview of Korean's tech startup support ecosystem. The Korean startup ecosystem did not exist just 20 years ago. The Korean government was trying to grow and find new ways to create jobs in the economy. We started to realize that entrepreneurship was the key to job creation. I think it was a similar situation in France. It was the main factor in a strong and innovative economy. When you look at the Korean startup scene today, the community is strong and growing. Over hundreds of $1 million a year has gone to funding late stage startups for a few years now. There is a lot of potential in blockchain, fintech, biotech, IoT, and Korean entertainment. As you know, the K-pop is the biggest hit in worldwide, which are the key growth area for Korea. It seems the culture has changed as well as more and more young Koreans are looking to get into entrepreneurship. We have seen many successful Korean entrepreneurs build successful startups over the last decade. This shows some accelerators and the government program and also some network and event and FAISE in Korea. The Seoul city government plans to nurture 10,000 workers to prepare them for the fourth industrial revolution and to help with unemployment through startups. Our Innovation Academy will train 2,000 young Koreans to play a leading role in the fourth industrial revolution. In addition, they will double the number of spaces for tech startups by 2022. As Veronique mentioned earlier in the introduction, the Korea is the strong country for the tech-based startups and tech-based companies. So furthermore, Seoul has cooperated with the Justice Ministry to introduce the startup visa fast track for young young foreign entrepreneurs who want to start their businesses in Seoul. This is for talking about the visa program. We have our own form of H-1B visa. It is called an E-7 visa. This allows employers to hire the skilled foreign workers to work in Korea. The aim was for these workers is to help fill a critical worker shortage in Korea, as well as allow Korean companies to remain strong and competitive globally. This will ultimately lead to the creation of thousands of jobs for Korean workers. However, the Korean government did not take into account Korea's working culture, which demands brutally long workers and an overload of work. So this is I would like to say like a very honest situation in Korea. So the working culture and living culture in Korea is a bit different from the West. The hour at the Korean company are very long, while it might say 9 to 6. In reality, you can't leave at 6 p.m. You need to wait for at least an hour, and if there is more work to do, you must finish it before you leave. Even if that means working until like 1 to 2 a.m. Some not every time, but like in crazy season. You most likely will not get overtime. The Korean bosses usually have crazy demands and deadlines which you can never question in public. Thankfully, the young Koreans and foreigners are slowly moving away from this archaic Korean working culture. So, regarding the entrepreneurs in Korea, the number of startups in South Korea in 2019 was close to 30,000, with over hundreds of thousands startup employees. Just 20 years ago, the number of startups was below 2,000. A vast majority of these startups are in Seoul, as you know, the Gangnam style, the Gangnam district. This helps drive trends and word of mouth about new products and services very quickly. Seoul is essentially a single market city within a conservative culture slowly adapting to entrepreneurship. Thanks to so many startups in Korea, many Koreans now have an alternative to working for a big conglomerate like Samsung, Hyundai, or LG. The older generation is starting to embrace entrepreneurship a lot more than in the past. Now, the young Koreans have the alternative to be an entrepreneur and run their own business. There are many government programs in Korea that help nurture new business ideas. In addition, there has been a rise in startup accelerators and incubators across Korea in many different sectors. So Korean government support for the Korean startup ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, the Korean government has encouraged more Korean entrepreneurs rather than foreign startup entrepreneurs. For example, the TIPS, the Accelerator Investment Driven Tech Incubator Program for startups in Korea, offers Korean government support to share the risk of business failure, especially for the tech-based companies. So, however, it requires the startup to have at least one Korean startup founder in the company. This is why you don't see a lot of foreigners working in Korea starting their own business. But you can include the Korean co-founders for your company at the beginning of the level. So there are a few programs such as the Seoul Global Startup Center, which help foreigners in Korea start businesses in Korea. Therefore, these startups don't need to find a co-founder that is Korean. However, it will be very difficult for foreign startups to win government contracts without a Korean co-founder. The startup funding in South Korea really started to take off in 2014. It went from $71 million in funding in 2013 to $949 million in 2014, then went to an all-time high of $1.8 billion in 2015. These days, it has settled down to around 500 to 600 million dollars per year. However, from 2017 to 2019, many Korean blockchain startups have found success raising funds through an ICO. Currently, in 2020, the ICO scene is pretty much non-existent. However, many Korean investors are still interested in blockchain technologies, and alternative fundraising methods could rise in 2020 through IEOs or STOs. All this shows that Korea has a large and diverse range of investors, Korea-based funds, corporate VCs, angels, and crowdfunding systems, just to name a few. I'd mention about the corporate support, like as the in France you have the Orange, the corporate support for the Korean startup ecosystem. I haven't mentioned some of the big corporations that have started their own startup hubs, like Lotte's accelerator program, Samsung's C-Lab Space, or Naver and their startup alliance. A lot of big corporations in South Korea are actively investing in local startups and helping support open innovation in Korea. However, there is still a large talent gap compared to the United States. We are talking about talented programmers, engineers, and developers. The top graduates tend to want to work for global companies like Apple or Google. Most of the gifted students in Korea tend to want to study abroad in the UK or the US. Once there, they usually don't come back to Korea. Many corporations in South Korea have started their own accelerator programs to find the talent and new innovative ideas. So as I mentioned, the blockchain the industry is quite like exploding. So I would like to mention about the Korean blockchain explosion. So the Korean startup ecosystem got a huge boost from the Korean blockchain explosion. Since late 2017, Koreans were buying cryptocurrencies from around the world, then selling them in Korea because of the price difference between exchanges. This was called the kimchi premium, and even mom and pops that knew nothing about the cryptocurrencies started to buy it. While this boom was long past, South Korea is one of the few countries in Asia that is very open to blockchain technologies. Corporations in Korea have always embraced the new technologies. One of these technologies is blockchain. Kakao, the top mobile platform in Korea, started Ground X, which will focus strictly on blockchain to create a scalable blockchain platform to help with mass adoption. This could open the door for new and innovative blockchain startups to work with Kakao and take advantage of their infrastructure. There is still pressure from the old generation in South Korea to get stable, secure jobs with big conglomerates like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai. However, like most corporations, they can't adopt new technologies as quickly as startups. While many Koreans still have a lot of fear about starting their own business, especially startup, the idea of working new and trendy technologies like blockchain could be a gateway for more Korean entrepreneurs to enter the startup scene. Since Korea is always looking to find the next tech wave, therefore there will always be an opportunity to join or start new and disruptive startups. So regarding the infrastructure, currently there are over 100 co-working spaces in Korea. Some of the big names include WeWork, Fast5, FabLab, Seoul Startup Hub, Google Campus Seoul, Maru 180, and the most recent Hayground. There are also over 150 accelerators, incubators, and innovation centers in South Korea. And Hayground impressed us the most with their community of change makers managed by Root Impact. Their facility is great, as well with their high-end design, open concept workstations, as well as a restaurant and bar on the bottom floor. There is even a blockchain co-working space, co-living space in Seoul called NONCE, NONCE. The COVID-19 has impacted many of these co-working spaces, and more companies in Korea are looking into remote work environments. It will be interesting to see if any of these co-working spaces in Korea will be able to survive as the future of work could change around the world. So I mentioned of some, some bad points in Korea, like the working conditions and working environment. So I would like to mention about the Korea's strength is why Korea. So first, the Korean culture. The South Korean popular culture is growing every year. Korean beauty products are thriving thanks to successful Korean startups like Mimi Box. I'm pretty sure like you already show some Korean the cosmetic products like the cushion, the air cushions or the mask packs. There are over 8,000 K-beauty brands in South Korea. Korean K-pop is bigger than ever thanks to groups like Big Bang, 21, and EXO. Korean drama are still being watched by fans all around the world, which helps to drive the latest trends in Korean fashion. And I should mention about the BTS. The Korea's biggest K-pop band, BTS, has broken all records on YouTube. Also, they were the first ever Korean musical host on SNL. Thanks to the success of BTS, their entertainment company, Big Hit Entertainment, will be doing an IPO, which will bring their market value to an incredible $4 billion. The rise of Korean content can be attributed to how well connected digital Korea is to be the world. The Korean IT infrastructure is one of the best in the world, as you know. The country has the best internet connection, and most Koreans own smartphones. Koreans are early adopters of the new technologies and early trendsetters for fashion. Companies are always on the lookout for the newest platforms to distribute their content to the world. Korean influencers have found much success on YouTube, Instagram, and even TikTok. And next, as I mentioned, the fintech. Fintech is also huge in the Korean startup ecosystem as Korea is becoming the leader in cryptocurrency exchange and services. Korea looks to become the leader in the global financial centers. Soon, Seoul will become the fintech hub of Asia. One of the top fintech startups in Korea is Viva Republica. They are the developer of the application called TOSS, a mobile payment tool that is looking to go global after having much success in Korea. Fintech startups in Korea will help Korea become a cashless society if it is not already there now. And last, the Korean consumers. The Korean startup ecosystem benefits from a great consumer market. We are crazy. They are middle class in the majority. Most people living in Korea have smartphones and a credit card. We have the highest GDP per capita, great wireless penetration, great infrastructure, and fast LTE. All these elements combine to make a great home market to grow young startups. This is why Korea is able to support companies and startups in Korea that are focused only on the domestic market. Korea has a 50 million residents that are very tech savvy. That is one of the main reasons why Korea is able to really scalable business. Some examples would be companies like Naver, Coupang, and Ticket Monster that solely focus on the Korean market. So these are all of my presentations. To be concluded, the South Korea needs to continue to invest in programs to help the Korean startup ecosystem. And entrepreneurship has proven time and time again to be the number one driver for job creation and economic growth. South Korea will never be able to compete with the Silicon Valley or Shanghai. However, we can leverage our own unique assets to create innovative startups. As long as we push to bring in more and more international talent into Korea, the more likely Korean startups will have the chance to go global. Korea's potential is there. There are many countries are recognizing it, and I fully believe that the Korean startup ecosystem will continue to accelerate. At the same time, it will produce global startups and hopefully some unicorns. So these are all of my presentations, and please feel free to ask me if you have any questions.